The flickering candlelight casts long shadows against the stone walls of a medieval scriptorium, where the air smells faintly of ink and parchment. Monks, dressed in simple robes, hunched over their desks in reverence to the divine task they had been entrusted with, copying sacred texts. The manuscripts they produced were considered the highest form of devotion, with each letter written painstakingly by hand, each word imbued with the power of the Holy Spirit. Yet, amidst the sacred prayers and psalms, some monks worked in secrecy, not with the pure works of the Church but with something far more dangerous. These were not just texts. They were forbidden knowledge, written words that the Church had sought to suppress for centuries, and some monks chose to preserve them, even at the risk of their own lives. But why? What was it about these manuscripts that made them so dangerous? What truths lay within them that the Church feared would shatter their monopoly on faith? To understand the tension at play, one must first grasp the grip the medieval Church held over knowledge. In the Dark Ages, the Church was not just a spiritual institution. It was the center of education, governance, and intellectual life. Only those within the clergy had access to literacy, and with it, the power to control what was written, and, more importantly, what was read. Knowledge was not free, it was heavily guarded. The Church determined what texts could be deemed holy, what scriptures could shape doctrine, and what was heretical. But in the quiet corners of monasteries, far from the gaze of inquisitors, something darker simmered. There were whispers of old, forgotten books that predated Christian orthodoxy, texts from a time when Christianity itself was in flux, when mysticism and alternative philosophies still thrived. These works offered a vision of Christianity that was not confined to the structure of the Church. They spoke of hidden knowledge, of secrets that threatened to undermine the very foundation of Church dogma. One such manuscript was the Gospel of Mary, a text believed to contain the teachings of Mary Magdalene, a woman often sidelined in Christian theology but believed by some to have held an elevated role in the early Christian movement. Another was the Apocalypse of Peter, which depicted the afterlife in a way that contrasted sharply with the Church's teachings on sin, judgment, and hell. These were not the works of heretics, but of those who had once walked closely with the very origins of Christianity. The Church, however, saw these texts as a direct challenge to their control over the narrative of salvation. In this opening section, we witness a monk, alone in a dimly lit room, his hands trembling as he carefully transcribes forbidden words, his mind torn between faith and a thirst for knowledge that could lead to his destruction. His candle flickers and threatens to go out as he writes the words of a gospel that could cost him his life. This is the atmosphere of a world where faith and fear intertwine, where what was once sacred becomes dangerous the moment it challenges the authority of the Church. As the section progresses, the narrative should zoom out, revealing the larger social and political forces at play. The Church's control over knowledge was not just a theological stance, it was a strategic one. In a world where literacy was scarce, where knowledge was the domain of a few, the written word had the power to shape empires. The rise of Christianity had already displaced ancient religious practices, many of which had their own written traditions. But even more terrifying to the Church was the idea that there were people who might attempt to resurrect these old ways. The Gnostic texts, the pagan rituals, the forgotten wisdom of earlier, more mystical Christianities. These monks, cloistered away in their stone sanctuaries, were the bearers of a forbidden truth, the keepers of knowledge that could alter the course of history. But what drove them to preserve these dangerous writings? Was it pure curiosity? Or was it a deeper, spiritual yearning for truth beyond the Church's teachings? A truth that, for them, could only be found in the secrecy of hidden texts? As we delve deeper into the story, this tension between sacred duty and intellectual rebellion will unfold. But for now, we are left with a haunting question. What did these texts contain, and why did the Church fear them so? This question will echo throughout the documentary, driving the narrative forward as we uncover the hidden truths that lay beneath the surface of medieval piety. The medieval world was a place of stark contrasts, towering stone cathedrals reaching for the heavens, where the faithful prayed in the shadow of the omnipotent Church, and in the quiet sanctuaries of monasteries, monks toiled in obscurity, crafting texts that would shape the future of Europe. These monks were the silent architects of Western thought, their quills moving in a meticulous dance, inscribing every word with reverence. For them, the act of writing was not just a task but a spiritual calling. In these secluded rooms, filled with the smell of aged parchment and ink, the monks were immersed in a process that bordered on the mystical. It wasn't just about transcription, it was about preservation. Preserving the Word of God, yes, but also preserving their own understanding of the world. For centuries, the monastic scriptorium was the beating heart of learning and spiritual practice. The written word was sacred, It had the power to heal, to curse, to bind, and to free. The act of copying sacred texts, of transcribing the word, was considered a direct communion with the divine. The monks were not just writers. They were the gatekeepers of knowledge, the ones entrusted with the power to translate the will of God into human language. But the role of the scribe was not merely academic. These men were acting as intermediaries between heaven and earth. Each stroke of their quill was imbued with divine authority. The texts they wrote were not just books, they were the means by which spiritual power flowed into the world. To alter these texts was to challenge the divine order itself. The monks were aware of this sacred responsibility. They believed that by copying these works, they were ensuring the continuation of God's word, and thus preserving the truth. But not all knowledge was considered divine. While the Church had carefully curated its own canon, it sought to suppress any works that didn't align with its teachings. This censorship didn't just limit access to texts, it extended into the realm of spiritual and intellectual power. The very foundation of medieval Christianity rested upon the control of knowledge. Only certain ideas were allowed to be disseminated. Only certain thoughts were deemed acceptable for contemplation. To deviate from this orthodoxy was not only dangerous but could lead to excommunication, a fate worse than death in a world where the afterlife was all important. The monks were, in a sense, the protectors of this knowledge, but they were also deeply conflicted. They had been taught that the Church was the ultimate authority, the direct link to God. Yet, there was an undercurrent of tension in the monasteries. The very men tasked with preserving the faith also had the skills to question it. There were whispers of other texts, of ancient scriptures that didn't fit neatly into the narrative the Church had constructed. Some monks found themselves drawn to these forbidden works, early Gnostic Gospels, apocryphal writings, and even pagan texts. To engage with these works was to risk everything: their positions, their reputations, even their lives. The tension between faith and intellectual rebellion existed not just in the monastery but in the very structure of medieval thought. While the Church sought to maintain control over all written knowledge, there were those who believed that hidden truths could be found in these suppressed texts. For a monk, discovering a forbidden text was an act of treason, a violation of the sacred trust placed in them. And yet, for some, the allure of the unknown was irresistible. Imagine the scene: a monk, alone in his cell, eyes scanning the pages of a forbidden gospel, perhaps a text like the Gospel of Thomas, which contained sayings of Christ that didn't align with the established doctrine. His fingers tremble as he reads words that seem to breathe with life, questioning everything he has been taught. The very fabric of his faith begins to unravel. Should he turn away from this knowledge, suppress it like the Church demands? Or does he embrace the truth hidden within these words, even at the cost of his soul? The decision is not easy, for it is not just about rebellion, it is about survival. To defy the Church was to invite persecution, to risk the wrath of the Inquisition. This section should also delve into the psychological and emotional toll such a conflict could have on the monks. The Church's power was absolute, and it left no room for doubt. To challenge the orthodoxy was to risk the purity of the soul. Yet, many monks felt a deep, almost divine compulsion to uncover hidden knowledge. It was as though they could sense that there was more to the story of Christianity than they had been told. They felt the weight of the manuscripts they were copying, knowing that some held truths that had been deliberately erased from history. The written word, then, was not just an instrument of divine will but also an object of desire. It was through these texts that knowledge and power could be passed on, whether they were deemed holy or heretical. The monks understood the sacred power of the script, but they also knew that not all power was benign. Knowledge could corrupt as easily as it could enlighten. And so, the act of copying, of preserving texts, became fraught with danger. What was acceptable and what was forbidden became a blurred line that could change with the whims of the Church. What was once a divine truth could, overnight, become a heretical lie. In the quiet scriptoriums, these monks became the stewards of history, not just guardians of divine knowledge but also of the lost truths that could challenge everything the Church had built. Their devotion to the written word was sacred, but the forbidden texts they encountered threatened to shatter the world they had known. As this section closes, the tension should be palpable. The monks are caught between the light of their faith and the shadow of hidden knowledge. The audience is left questioning how far a man would go to uncover the truth, and whether it is worth the sacrifice. The writing of these words, once thought to be pure, becomes a dangerous dance with the divine and the damned. The 12th century in Europe was a time of intellectual awakening, a time when the dusty scrolls of ancient knowledge began to resurface, challenging the tightly controlled narrative of the Church. The walls of the monasteries, meant to shield the sacred, had also become the prisons of ideas ideas that, if released, could shake the very foundations of Christianity. The Church's tight grip on the written word had kept these ideas buried for centuries, but now the floodgates were beginning to open. What had been suppressed for so long began to rise, and with it came the terrifying specter of heresy. Heretics were not always what we think of today, men and women burning with a desire to overthrow the Church. Many were simply scholars, monks, and philosophers seeking knowledge that extended beyond the limits of orthodoxy. For centuries, the Church had defined what was true, what was holy, and what was divine. It was an institution built on the idea that the human soul was under the Church's jurisdiction, and only through its teachings could salvation be achieved. To stray from this path, to think differently, was to risk not only your eternal soul but your very life. And yet, as the 12th century progressed, this was exactly what began to happen. At the heart of this intellectual insurrection were the ancient Gnostic texts, which offered radically different understandings of Christianity. These texts, some of which had been hidden away for centuries, suggested that salvation wasn't just about faith in Christ but about personal esoteric knowledge, gnosis. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, presented Jesus as a figure who revealed hidden spiritual truths, not just the doctrines of the Church. It showed a vision of Christ that was more mystical and less dogmatic, suggesting that anyone could reach divine knowledge through inner experience, not through the intercession of the Church. This was a dangerous idea. As these ancient writings began to circulate again, scholars and monks found themselves grappling with ideas that the Church had long deemed heretical. Figures like Peter Abelard, a French philosopher and theologian, found themselves in the crossfire. Abelard's rational approach to theology, which questioned the role of God's will and the nature of salvation, was seen as a direct challenge to Church orthodoxy. His teachings gained a massive following, but they also invited the wrath of the Church, which would eventually condemn him as a heretic. Abelard wasn't alone. Across Europe, new intellectual movements began to spread, some inspired by these Gnostic ideas, others by the rediscovery of ancient texts from the Roman and Greek worlds. In a world where the vast majority of people were illiterate and at the mercy of the clergy for their understanding of the divine, the challenge these thinkers posed was monumental. These ideas didn't just question doctrine, they questioned the very authority of the Church itself. The story of the rise of heresy is not one of grand, overt rebellion, but one of quiet resistance. It's the story of monks who began to whisper about a different truth, scholars who risked their reputations to question the teachings of the Pope, and individuals who believed that true spiritual enlightenment could be found outside the walls of the Church. The most dangerous of these thinkers weren't necessarily those who sought to dismantle Christianity, but those who sought to understand it more deeply, who thought there might be more to the story than what they had been taught. One of the most striking examples of this quiet revolution was the rise of the Cathar heresy in southern France. The Cathars believed in a dualistic view of the world, in which the material world was the creation of an evil god and the spiritual world was the domain of the true God. They rejected the authority of the Pope, the clergy, and the sacraments. The Cathars were not merely rebelling against the Church's power, they were rebelling against the very concept of institutionalized faith. For them, salvation lay in purity and asceticism, not in the rituals or dogma that the Church preached. The Church's reaction to the spread of these ideas was swift and brutal. The Cathars were labeled heretics, and in 1209, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade, a bloody and ruthless campaign designed to wipe out the Cathar heresy once and for all. Thousands were killed and entire communities were annihilated. The message was clear: any deviation from the official narrative would be met with violence and extermination. But the Cathars were not the only ones. In other parts of Europe, heretical movements began to sprout like weeds in a garden. The Waldensians, a group of lay preachers in northern Italy, also rejected the authority of the Pope and preached a return to the simplicity of the early Church. They believed that the Bible, not the clergy, should be the ultimate authority. These groups, like the Cathars, sought to bypass the Church and find their own path to salvation. They were driven by the belief that the truths of Christianity were not owned by the Church, they were accessible to everyone. The most chilling part of this period of intellectual rebellion is that many of these movements didn't see themselves as enemies of Christianity. They saw themselves as the true keepers of Christian teachings, striving to purify the faith from the corruption of the Church. But in a world where the Church held absolute power, these ideas could not coexist with the official narrative. The conflict was not just theological, it was political. The Church's very authority was at stake. If these heresies spread, if the common people began to see the Church as corrupt or misguided, the Church could lose everything. In this section, The narrative should build toward the growing tension between the monastic world and these heretical ideas. The monks who secretly read forbidden texts, the philosophers who questioned sacred dogmas, and the heretics who took a stand against the church, all these individuals became part of a larger intellectual battle that would come to define the course of medieval history. For these heretics, the pursuit of knowledge was not just about academic curiosity, it was about survival, a survival of the soul, of truth, and of a vision of Christianity that was radically different from the one held by the church. As the section concludes, the viewer is left with a haunting realization. The church's power was built not just on the control of faith, but on the suppression of knowledge. It was an intellectual monopoly, one that could not tolerate any ideas that threatened its grip on authority. The rise of heresy was not merely a challenge to doctrine, but to the very idea that one institution could control the spiritual and intellectual life of an entire continent. And the battle for knowledge was just beginning. The medieval world was defined by one simple and horrifying truth: to stand against the church was to risk everything, not just your body but your soul. The power of the church was absolute, and its grip on society was so firm that even a whisper of dissent could bring down ruin. The Inquisition, the most feared tool of the church, was designed not just to uncover heresy, but to break the will of anyone who dared to challenge its teachings. Imagine, if you will, the dim, oppressive atmosphere of a medieval courtroom. The smell of damp stone, the murmur of voices, and the weight of fear hanging in the air. Here, a monk stands before the clergy, trembling in the presence of inquisitors, his heart racing as the accusations are read aloud. His crime? The very act of seeking truth beyond the teachings of the church, the possession of forbidden texts, the act of questioning, the desire to understand what was hidden. And now this monk, once a trusted servant of God, is condemned. But the punishments for heresy went beyond simple imprisonment or exile. Heresy was viewed as an attack not just on the church, but on the very fabric of society itself. To question the doctrines of the church was seen as a direct challenge to the divine order, an act of defiance against God. And defiance, in the eyes of the church, was a sin punishable by the harshest means. The punishment for heresy was not swift, nor was it simple. It was a slow and agonizing process, designed to break not only the body but also the spirit. The inquisitors were not just concerned with the physical confession of the accused, they wanted to destroy the very core of their faith, to force them into submission to the will of the church. Torture became an essential tool in this quest for conformity. The monks and scholars who were accused of heresy were often subjected to horrific physical abuse in an attempt to elicit a confession. The rack, the Iron Maiden, and the waterboarding, these were not just instruments of pain, they were instruments of fear designed to break the mind and soul. The rack, with its cruel stretching of limbs, often left the body disfigured for life. The Iron Maiden, with its sharp spikes, would pierce the skin and leave permanent marks of suffering. But it was the mental torment that was most effective. The isolation, the fear of eternal damnation, the guilt of betraying the faith. The monks were not just tortured for their bodies, they were tortured for their souls, forced to confront the possibility that they might never again find solace in the embrace of God. In the cells of the inquisitors there was no mercy. If the monk didn't confess, the punishment became more brutal. The psychological pressure was constant. The feeling that the very fabric of their soul was at risk, that they could lose not only their life but their place in heaven. The constant whispers of damnation, the ever-present threat of excommunication, were a form of torture in themselves. Even those who escaped the physical abuse were often broken spiritually, unable to escape the constant guilt and fear that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Perhaps the most horrific punishment of all was the auto da fe, the public execution of heretics, which became a spectacle of fear and control. Imagine the scene: a large square crowded with onlookers, the smell of burning flesh and wood in the air. The accused heretic is paraded through the streets, a symbol of what could happen to anyone who dared to challenge the church. They were often burned alive, their bodies consumed by the flames as the church watched over, ensuring that the sinner's soul would be purged by fire. It was not just an execution, it was an exorcism, a final purging of heresy from the world. But while the auto da fe was the most dramatic, it was far from the only punishment. Many monks who were accused of heresy were simply imprisoned in dark, damp cells for the rest of their lives. They were left to rot in isolation, their minds slowly unraveling as they questioned whether they had been right to seek the truth. Some monks were forced to wear a San Benito, a penitential garment that marked them as heretics, a constant reminder of their fall from grace. The toll on the accused monks was devastating, but the toll on the rest of society was just as profound. The fear of the Inquisition created an atmosphere of constant surveillance and suspicion. Monks, once brothers in faith, turned on each other, accusing their fellow scholars of heresy to save their own lives. Loyalty and trust, the foundation of monastic life, were shattered. The Inquisition didn't just destroy individuals, it destroyed communities torn apart by fear, guilt, and the constant threat of punishment. This section should also explore the psychological effects of such punishment. The punishment wasn't just physical, it was designed to extract a confession, to break down the very essence of the individual's beliefs. Some monks who were subjected to the Inquisition confessed to things they hadn't done, simply to end the torturous cycle. Others recanted their beliefs, only to live the rest of their lives in guilt and fear, knowing that they had betrayed what they believed to be the truth. The sheer cruelty of these methods speaks to the Church's desperation to maintain control over its flock. Knowledge was power, and the Church knew that if the wrong ideas were allowed to spread, it could lose its hold over the people. The punishment of heresy was not just a tool of correction, it was a weapon of control. It was an act of terror, designed to ensure that no one dared question the teachings of the Church again. As we close this section, the viewer should be left with a chilling understanding of the lengths the Church went to in order to maintain its authority. The Inquisitors' wrath was not just about punishing the body, it was about punishing the mind, forcing the faithful to submit not just outwardly but inwardly. The cost of knowledge was high, and the consequences of seeking forbidden truths were often fatal. In the shadows of the towering stone walls of the medieval monasteries, where the faithful knelt in prayer and scribes transcribed the Holy Scriptures, there existed another hidden world, a world filled with dangerous books, suppressed knowledge, and forbidden truths. These hidden libraries were not mere collections of heretical works, they were sanctuaries for the intellectual rebels of the age, the ones who understood that knowledge, once written, could never truly be extinguished, even by the Church. Imagine the secrecy involved in maintaining these hidden archives. Behind thick, dusty walls, far from the prying eyes of inquisitors, monks worked in silence to preserve manuscripts that could, if discovered, lead to their execution. The monasteries were supposed to be places of piety, obedience, and absolute faith. And yet, within these sacred walls, hidden beneath layers of stone and scripture, there existed a repository of subversive thought, a library of works that could challenge the very authority of the Church. These were not just ordinary texts. These were ancient scrolls, some of them older than Christianity itself, filled with ideas that the Church could never accept. Gnostic gospels, apocryphal scriptures, and pagan philosophies that contradicted the teachings of the Church were carefully preserved in these secret libraries. The monks who chose to protect these texts knew the risks they were taking. To hide a forbidden text was to place oneself directly in the line of fire. The Church's inquisitors were always on the lookout for signs of intellectual disobedience, and the penalty for harboring such texts was swift and deadly. But still, some monks took the risk. They understood that knowledge, even knowledge that seemed dangerous, could offer something invaluable, the truth. These hidden libraries became havens for the preservation of forgotten wisdom. Monks would often disguise the forbidden texts, hiding them inside the covers of seemingly harmless books or burying them in the deepest recesses of the monastery. Some were even hidden inside the false walls of the scriptoriums themselves, tucked away where only the most trusted guardians of knowledge could reach them. Imagine a monk, late at night, his candle flickering as he quietly opens a secret compartment inside his desk. There, hidden beneath the pages of a Bible, lies a Gnostic gospel, such as the Gospel of Mary, a text that presents a radically different view of Christ and his teachings. He carefully reads the words by the faint glow of his candle, the heat of fear rising in his chest as he wonders if the inquisitors might be just one step behind him. This is no longer an act of religious devotion. It is an act of rebellion, a quiet defiance against the institution that controls all knowledge. These monks were not merely preserving books, they were preserving the truth. They knew that if the world were to learn the contents of these forbidden texts, the Church would lose its stranglehold on spiritual authority. The Church controlled not only the sacraments and the rituals but the very fabric of belief itself. And the texts hidden away in these secret libraries contained ideas that threatened to unravel everything the Church had worked so hard to build. The question arises, what drove these monks to take such a risk? Was it pure intellectual curiosity, the thirst for knowledge that refused to be quenched by the dogmatic teachings of the Church? Or was it something deeper, a spiritual longing, a sense that the true message of Christianity had been lost, obscured by centuries of political power plays? Perhaps it was both. The monks who hid these books were often scholars in their own right, men who had spent years studying the scriptures and the early Christian writings. They understood that the Gnostic texts and apocryphal gospels held a key to understanding a Christianity that had been suppressed, a Christianity that offered a more personal, mystical connection with God. The Church's narrative of salvation through faith alone, without any personal, spiritual experience, was too narrow for these intellectual rebels. In some cases, these hidden libraries became more than just repositories of books. They became places where monks could gather in secret, sharing their knowledge and their doubts about the Church's teachings. These libraries were sanctuaries of forbidden thought, where intellectual debates could unfold, free from the ever-watchful eye of the Inquisition. And while the monks who participated in these secret gatherings risked everything, their reputations, their positions, even their lives, they believed that what they were doing was essential for the survival of the true Christian spirit. But the secrecy surrounding these hidden libraries was not without its own toll. For the monks who protected these texts, there was always the gnawing fear that they could be discovered at any moment. The tension between their religious duty and the desire for intellectual freedom created a psychological burden that was often unbearable. To be caught harboring forbidden knowledge was to face a slow and agonizing death. Yet, the more these monks immersed themselves in the ancient texts, the more they felt a deep sense of purpose in preserving them. They believed they were part of a sacred mission, one that would one day reveal the true message of Christ to the world, free from the shackles of church dogma. The hidden libraries were not just places where forbidden books were kept. They were symbols of intellectual and spiritual rebellion. They were places where the pursuit of truth, no matter how dangerous or subversive, was seen as a noble endeavor. And though these libraries were hidden from the world, their legacy would eventually emerge. For in the centuries to come, as the Renaissance and the Reformation unfolded, the knowledge kept within these secret sanctuaries would help to spark a revolution in thought and belief. As the section draws to a close, the viewer should be left with a haunting image, the image of those ancient texts buried beneath stone walls, waiting to be rediscovered. The monks who hid these works knew they were preserving something precious, something that could one day change the world. And perhaps in some ways they knew that these texts, hidden in the shadows for so long, would one day see the light again, bringing with them the truths that had been buried for centuries. The medieval period was a time of profound fear and repression, and at the center of this fear stood an institution more powerful than any monarch or warlord, the Church. But within the Church, one group stood out as the enforcers of its divine will, the Inquisitors. These shadowy figures, often feared and loathed, were tasked with rooting out heresy, subverting any challenge to church doctrine, and ensuring that knowledge remained firmly in the hands of those deemed worthy, namely, the clergy. To challenge the authority of the Church was to risk everything, and the Inquisitor's job was simple: to ensure that no one ever dared. The mere presence of an Inquisitor could send shockwaves through a community. Dressed in simple yet stern robes, these men carried the weight of the Church's authority with them like a weapon. Their primary goal was not just to find those who defied the Church's teachings but to eliminate the very idea that such defiance was possible. They represented the eyes of the Church, ever watchful, ever present, and ever vigilant. The methods of the Inquisitors were as relentless as they were terrifying. Inquisitors weren't just detectives of the mind, they were psychological warriors, skilled in the art of coercion and manipulation. They didn't simply ask questions, they extracted confessions. They used every form of psychological pressure, from manipulation to outright threats of death or eternal damnation, to break down the minds and spirits of those they interrogated. They understood that fear was the most effective tool in maintaining control, and they wielded it like a scalpel. In this section we delve into the inner workings of the Inquisition, exploring the toll it took on both the accused and those who carried out its work. To understand this, we must first examine the all-encompassing influence of the Inquisitors. Their power stretched far beyond the walls of the Church. They had the ear of kings and queens, the loyalty of local magistrates, and the support of powerful clergy. They were, in effect, the Church's secret police, with the full backing of divine authority. Imagine a town in medieval Europe, a quiet village nestled in the hills. The villagers go about their daily lives, farming, tending to livestock, and attending Mass on Sundays. But one morning the atmosphere shifts. News spreads that Inquisitors are coming. A shadow falls over the village. People become wary, suspicious of one another. Friends become enemies. Neighbors look over their shoulders, afraid that someone might accuse them of heresy. The Inquisitors do not need to act directly to control the population. Their mere presence creates a climate of fear that suffocates the spirit of rebellion. This fear is the true weapon of the Inquisition, not the torture devices or the pyres, but the constant, invisible pressure on the minds of those who dared to think differently. The Inquisitors did not operate in a vacuum. They had an army of informants, ordinary citizens who, out of fear, greed, or even ideological zeal, would report their neighbors for signs of heretical thought or behavior. The mere whisper of heresy could ruin lives. Families were torn apart, friendships shattered, and entire communities destroyed in the name of faith. Those accused were not just criminals in the eyes of the church, they were enemies of God and the soul. And no one, no matter how pious, was safe from the all-seeing eye of the inquisitors. The nature of the Inquisition was insidious. It wasn't just about finding heretics, it was about controlling thought itself. To ensure total obedience, the inquisitors didn't just punish those who acted against the church's teachings. They punished the very idea that such dissent was possible. People were taught to police their own thoughts, to fear the consequences of questioning the church, even in the quiet recesses of their minds. In this section, the narrative should delve into the psychological toll that living under the ever-present threat of the Inquisition had on the population. Imagine the anxiety, the paranoia, the constant surveillance that pervaded daily life. A simple conversation could turn dangerous. A glance, a gesture, a seemingly innocent question could be misinterpreted as a sign of rebellion. The pressure to conform was immense. Consider a monk in his cloister, a man whose entire life had been devoted to the study of theology and scripture. He had spent years of his life in silence, immersed in the holy texts. But one day he stumbles upon an old manuscript, a text written by an early Christian philosopher that challenges the church's teachings on salvation. The monk is torn. The words of the text speak to him deeply, but he knows the cost of engaging with it. Does he dare to explore these forbidden thoughts? If the inquisitors were to find out, he would be condemned as a heretic, stripped of his sacred status, and perhaps even executed. He is paralyzed by fear, unable to act on the desire for knowledge that burns within him. This psychological dilemma was one faced by many during the reign of the Inquisition. The fear of discovery, the knowledge that any deviation from the accepted doctrine could lead to unimaginable suffering, forced people into a state of constant submission. Even the most pious individuals, those most committed to the faith, lived under the shadow of the Inquisitors' watch. The Inquisitors weren't just tasked with uncovering heretics. They were tasked with breaking the spirit of any who dared to think for themselves. They weren't merely concerned with the mind, they were concerned with the soul. If a man or woman was caught thinking heretically, it wasn't just their body that was at risk, it was their eternal soul. The Inquisitors' ultimate weapon was the idea of damnation. The threat of eternal suffering in hell was often enough to break the will of the most devout believer. The psychological toll on the Inquisitors themselves was equally profound. These men were tasked with carrying out acts of terror in the name of God. The moral justification for their actions was simple. They were protecting the Church, the ultimate authority on spiritual matters. But over time, the power to judge, to interrogate, and to punish could corrupt even the most devout of men. The line between duty and sadism blurred. In the name of purifying the soul, inquisitors became agents of fear, their minds twisted by the very authority they served. The section should end on a chilling note, reflecting on the pervasive nature of fear that the inquisitors had created. The idea that knowledge itself was dangerous, that the very pursuit of truth could lead to damnation, haunted every intellectual pursuit. It left its mark not only on those who were accused of heresy but on the entire population, forcing a silence that would last centuries. The Inquisitors' watch was not just about protecting the faith, it was about ensuring that the Church's control over knowledge was absolute. As the section closes, the viewer is left with a lingering sense of dread, understanding the pervasive influence of the Inquisition. The idea that even in the quietest corners of the medieval world, the Inquisitors' eyes were always upon you, watching, waiting for any sign of dissent. The Inquisition was not just a tribunal for physical punishment, it was an institution designed to wage a psychological war. The trial of heretics was not merely about uncovering truth, it was about breaking the spirit, dismantling the very core of belief, and forcing the accused to recant in the face of divine retribution. The most insidious aspect of these trials was that they were intellectual crucifixions, acts of destruction that sought to annihilate the mind of the accused in the name of religious purity. The toll they took on both the body and soul of the accused is a story that intertwines terror with profound moral anguish. In the dungeons of the Inquisition, where darkness and cold were constant companions, a single light would often flicker above the accused. The space was sparse, deliberately uncomfortable, to increase the mental anguish of the prisoner. For those accused of heresy, this was the first trial, the trial of endurance. The physical isolation, the confinement, the stark stone walls, all served as precursors to the psychological warfare that would follow. The initial stage of the trial was built on the idea of forcing the heretic to confront their very thoughts, their deepest beliefs. In a sense, the prisoner was forced to be their own judge. The inquisitors, masters of psychological manipulation, knew that the best way to break a heretic was not through force alone but through sowing doubt. They didn't simply confront their prisoners with accusations, they twisted the very fabric of the accused beliefs. The first step was to bring the prisoner face to face with their own actions. "Why did you read this book?" the inquisitor might ask as they placed the forbidden text before the accused. "What made you question the church's teachings?" This questioning, though simple in form, was calculated to force the accused to doubt their own reasoning, to wonder if perhaps they had misunderstood their spiritual path. The inquisitors would even use scripture against the accused, twisting passages from the Bible to make them question their own faith. "Are you sure," they would ask, "that you are not deluding yourself? Can you be certain that your understanding of the gospel is the correct one?" For those accused, these moments of doubt could be the most terrifying. They had been trained to believe that the church held absolute truth. To question it, to think that there might be another interpretation of the divine will, was not just a crime, it was blasphemy. The idea that their very soul might be in danger was terrifying enough to break even the most devout of believers. These trials weren't just about proving guilt, they were about creating a spiritual crisis that would lead to confession. In this atmosphere, many prisoners found themselves at war with their own minds. The mere act of being accused of heresy forced them into a psychological labyrinth from which there seemed to be no escape. If they admitted to reading forbidden texts or entertaining heretical thoughts, they were admitting to their own damnation. If they denied it, they were left to wonder if they were lying to save themselves. Either way, they were trapped in a mental and spiritual prison. As the trial progressed, the inquisitors would bring in witnesses, other prisoners, often coerced into testifying against their fellow heretics. These witnesses were themselves the victims of psychological manipulation, broken by torture or threats of eternal damnation. When these confessions were presented in court, they added an extra layer of terror. The accused might have to confront not only their own internal doubts but also the betrayal of those they once considered allies. To be labeled a heretic by your own friends and fellow believers was an experience that shattered the sense of community that was supposed to be the cornerstone of religious life. The resulting isolation was as much a punishment as the physical torment. The fear of confession became a weapon in itself. Those accused were often told that their souls could only be saved through repentance. This added a terrifying spiritual dimension to the trial. Confession wasn't just an admission of guilt, it was a necessity for redemption. But for many, the cost of confession was too high. To confess heresy was to sever the bond with the divine, to admit that one's soul was beyond salvation. The thought of eternal damnation was too great a weight to bear. However, some, despite the mounting psychological pressure, refused to recant. These individuals were the true intellectual martyrs, standing firm against an institution that sought to rewrite their understanding of truth and spirituality. In the face of the inquisitors' relentless questioning, their resolve remained unbroken. These were the ones who faced the harshest punishment, execution. The church's message was clear: refuse to conform and you will be cast out. The intellectual crucifixion was complete. For those who did recant, the trial wasn't over. Even if they confessed and were absolved, the mental scars remained. The trauma of the trial, the fear of damnation, the guilt of having questioned the church, stayed with the accused long after the physical pain had faded. Many lived in a state of spiritual limbo, tortured by the thought that they might have betrayed their true beliefs for the sake of survival. The psychological consequences were profound and often lasted a lifetime. They would never fully regain their former lives, their former peace of mind. In the broader societal context, these intellectual trials served a much larger purpose. They were meant to enforce conformity and eliminate any challenge to the church's teachings. The church understood that knowledge was power, and those who controlled it controlled the fate of the soul. The trials were a way of keeping knowledge from spreading, of ensuring that only one narrative could thrive. The inquisitors, by targeting those who dared to challenge the accepted interpretation of Christianity, prevented the possibility of competing spiritual or intellectual movements from gaining ground. By the end of the trial, the accused had often been reduced to nothing more than a shell of their former selves. The psychological toll of the Inquisition, with its intellectual torture, had left a permanent mark. Even those who survived and managed to return to society found themselves living in the shadow of what they had endured. Their minds, once free to explore the depths of knowledge, were now haunted by the fear of persecution. The damage done to their spirits could never be fully undone. As the section closes, the viewer is left to reflect on the true nature of intellectual persecution. It wasn't simply about silencing dissent, it was about controlling the mind itself. The Inquisition didn't just punish the body, it sought to conquer the very soul, to mold it into the shape the Church desired. The price of knowledge, the price of intellectual rebellion, was steep, and the consequences were not just physical but deeply psychological. The legacy of these trials is still felt today in the way societies grapple with freedom of thought and expression. At the heart of every medieval heresy trial lay one simple question: do you confess? This was not just a question of whether the accused would admit to a crime or act of rebellion. It was the question of whether they would admit to a fundamental betrayal of their faith, a betrayal so profound that it would jeopardize not only their earthly life but their eternal soul. Confession during the Inquisition wasn't merely an acknowledgement of guilt, it was a spiritual transaction, a ritualistic exchange where the prisoner's fate was sealed, and their soul's salvation hung in the balance. The environment of the confession room, often cold, stark, and intimidating, was designed to strip away any last vestiges of the prisoner's will. The accuser and the accused would sit in an emotionally charged silence, broken only by the whispered questions of the inquisitors. For the accused, the tension was unbearable. They stood at the threshold between redemption and eternal damnation. Confession wasn't just a means of escape from torture. It was presented as the only route to divine mercy. But the price of this salvation was profound, for confession meant that they had betrayed their very beliefs. Imagine the emotional turmoil of a monk, standing in a dimly lit cell, his hands trembling as the inquisitor demands an answer. His heart races as he faces a question that cuts deeper than any blade. Did you read the forbidden texts? For this monk, the books in question were not just dangerous intellectual pursuits. They were a path to understanding the world in a way that contradicted the very foundation of the Church. But to confess would mean to renounce everything he had believed in. To confess would mean admitting that he had been wrong, that his intellectual and spiritual journey had led him into sin. For the inquisitors, confession was both a tool and a weapon. Their power lay not in the ability to force a confession, but in the ability to manipulate the very soul of the prisoner. The idea was not to simply extract an admission of guilt but to coerce the accused into acknowledging their spiritual failings. This was where the true power of the Church lay, in its control over the soul, in its claim to be the only gatekeeper to salvation. The Inquisition's success was not in punishing the body but in crushing the spirit, convincing the accused that they were beyond redemption without the Church's intervention. As the accused struggled with the question of confession, they faced a terrible dilemma. On one hand, to confess meant survival. The inquisitors promised that those who confessed their heresy would be spared the most brutal forms of torture and execution. They would be absolved by the Church, their souls saved, but at the cost of their intellectual and spiritual integrity. On the other hand, to deny the accusations meant suffering the consequences of their defiance. The threat of execution, or worse, being forced to watch loved ones suffer in their place, was enough to break even the strongest wills. Yet many prisoners, unable to bear the psychological strain of their predicament, broke. Confession, to them, became the only way to avoid the horror of the inquisitors' tools. But for others, the decision to confess was not as simple. These individuals were not simply acting out of fear. They were deeply conflicted. For them, confession was not just an admission of guilt, it was a negotiation with their soul. To confess was to acknowledge the possibility that they had been wrong in their beliefs. It meant accepting that their pursuit of truth had led them into dangerous territory. These were the intellectual martyrs, those who struggled with the guilt of betrayal and the moral cost of survival. To them, the act of confession was a kind of spiritual death. They would forever carry the weight of their decision, unable to reconcile their intellectual journey with the actions they were forced to take to save their lives. The emotional toll of confession was not just internal, it was external as well. The process of confession was humiliating, stripping the accused of their dignity and forcing them to make a public spectacle of their spiritual failure. Those who confessed were often paraded through the streets, wearing the sanbenito, a garment that marked them as heretics. This public humiliation was part of the Church's effort to make the act of confession a public lesson in obedience. The confession wasn't just about saving the soul of the individual, it was a demonstration to society that defying the Church came with consequences. In this way, confession became a tool for maintaining control, not just over the accused but over the population at large. The confession of the soul, however, was not a guarantee of redemption. For the accused, the confession often left them in a state of profound spiritual limbo. They were absolved by the Church, but at what cost? Their minds were haunted by the question, did I truly believe what I confessed? The guilt of having renounced their intellectual and spiritual path could never be fully erased. Those who were forced to confess were often left living with the knowledge that they had betrayed their own understanding of the divine, forever struggling to reconcile their faith with the truths they had once held dear. Moreover, the very act of confession, while it may have brought temporary relief from physical torture, often led to a psychological and emotional breakdown that could last a lifetime. The confessor was left with the moral burden of having submitted to the will of the Church, which wielded the power to dictate what was true and what was not. The confessions, no matter how sincere, could never fully restore the accused's sense of self, for the soul had been shattered by the ordeal. In this section we also see the societal impact of the confession. As the Inquisition spread, it instilled a deep fear in the population. The idea that any person, no matter how devout, could be accused of heresy and forced to confess, sent ripples of terror throughout society. People began to police their own thoughts, living in constant fear that the smallest deviation from orthodoxy could lead to their spiritual destruction. The act of confession became not just a personal trial but a societal one. It created an atmosphere of mistrust, fear, and spiritual paralysis, where the quest for knowledge became a dangerous gamble. As the section draws to a close, the viewer is left with a haunting question: at what cost does salvation come? For the accused, the cost of redemption was not just physical pain or the loss of life, it was the fracturing of their very soul. Confession, the Church promised, would save them. But it came at the expense of their integrity, their intellect, and their deepest spiritual beliefs. The confession of the soul was not just an act of survival, it was a sacrifice, one that many could not bear, and one that shaped the very moral fabric of medieval society. As the flames of the Inquisition faded and the last embers of burned heretics died out, the chilling legacy it left behind did not quickly extinguish. The intellectual repression, the deep-rooted fear instilled by inquisitors, cast a long shadow stretching far beyond its final trials. The societal scars of the Inquisition continued to affect generations, embedding a deeply rooted fear of knowledge and thought that would shape European intellectual life for centuries. The Inquisition was not just an institution of punishment, it was a tool for creating a culture of fear, a fear so profound that it influenced every aspect of medieval society. It cultivated an environment where questioning became dangerous. To challenge orthodoxy, to entertain new ideas, was to risk one's very soul. The inquisitors succeeded in making knowledge synonymous with sin. The most terrifying consequence of this was not the physical punishment of those accused but the psychic toll it took on society, the knowledge that even the slightest deviation from accepted doctrine could lead to unimaginable suffering. For generations following the Inquisition, the power of the Church continued to shape intellectual life. The fear of being accused of heresy or blasphemy was so ingrained that people learned to avoid questioning the dominant worldview. The very act of intellectual curiosity became fraught with peril. Scholars and thinkers, even in more enlightened times, still felt the weight of the Inquisition on their work. New ideas, particularly those challenging the Church's teachings, were met with suspicion and often outright hostility. The Inquisition had turned knowledge itself into a weapon. For those who dared to pursue intellectual freedom, the threat of persecution was ever present. In many ways, the Church's ability to control knowledge became even more powerful than its ability to control the body. The mind, once thought to be free, was now under the same strict surveillance. Scholars and philosophers who would come to challenge Church doctrine in later centuries, like Galileo or Copernicus, were still forced to reckon with the Church's enduring influence. Their ideas were revolutionary, but so dangerous that they could lead to charges of heresy. Yet, the Inquisition's true legacy is not just the direct oppression of intellectuals during its reign, but the culture of fear it planted in society. It was not enough for the Church to silence dissent. They had to instill such fear that no one would dare to speak out again. The lesson was clear. Questioning the Church was dangerous, not just for the body but for the soul. This pervasive fear of knowledge would lead to centuries of intellectual passivity, where conformity became the path of least resistance. Even as the Inquisition ended, the damage to the intellectual fabric of Europe was profound. Those who were educated in the time of the Inquisition grew up in an atmosphere where ideas were closely policed, and those who dared to challenge the established order were cast out, silenced, or worse. The social and psychological toll of living under such scrutiny left a lasting imprint on generations. The intellectual paralysis created by the Inquisition meant that the full development of European thought was stunted, as thinkers feared they would face similar retribution for their ideas. This culture of intellectual fear was not confined to the medieval period. The legacy of the Inquisition influenced future movements, including the rise of totalitarian regimes that would use similar tactics of censorship to control knowledge. The concept of thought crime did not end in the 15th century, it evolved, reappearing in various forms throughout history. The connection between power and the control of ideas remained an integral part of how governments maintain their control. In the modern world, although the Inquisition itself is a distant memory, its influence can still be felt. Censorship, ideological conformity, and the persecution of intellectual dissent continue to plague societies where free thought is not protected. From political repression to the silencing of unpopular ideas, the legacy of fear is not just historical. It is alive and well in many parts of the world. The Inquisition's methods may have evolved, but the fundamental idea remains the same. Knowledge, if uncontrolled, is dangerous. As we reflect on this legacy, it is impossible to ignore the profound moral implications of this history. The Inquisition teaches us a vital lesson, that the control of knowledge is not just an act of power but one of suppression, and that the fear of knowledge can hinder human progress. Today, as we push the boundaries of understanding, we must remember the past. The consequences of silencing thought, of making knowledge a crime, are far-reaching and irreversible. The lesson of the Inquisition is not just about the cruelty of the past, but about the vigilance needed to ensure that intellectual freedom never again falls victim to such fear.